I have
Failing a test. I'm failing a
congestion
test.
of the mind right now.
Well, you
cover
did get it.
this?
You did get it right, but you were actually maybe right in both ways because congestion pricing does intersect with it.
Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
So how was the big India and Sri Lanka trip?
It was great. I really appreciate you going solo here last week. I was sorry to miss Ashley and Michael. That was a great conversation. But I was at literary festivals in Jaipur, India, and also in Galle, Sri Lanka. And there were great readers in both places, but it was especially wild and special to engage with readers in Sri Lanka this time around.
What were they saying to you?
I just think more people had read the book. And so it was possible to have really interesting conversations about like history and craft and character. Gratifyingly, a lot of people who were like, this was really meaningful to me, which, as you might imagine, after such a long time working on the book, meant a lot to hear.
Well, you should have just stayed there. I mean, not that I don't like having you back, but it was warm there, I assume, and like it's cold as hell and here anyway in Kansas City, and I assume quite cold in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I didn't even pack my jacket, and then I landed and it was -7 degrees, which was awesome.
Yikes.
But worse than that, I had like this sort of terrible, sickening feeling on the return flight. And I realized once I landed why it was, and it was because of Donald Trump. That I just felt nauseated.
I would thought that you were going to say that the readers wanted to talk to you about Trump or were asking you like, what the hell is going on? Did they also do that?
They just were sort of like, oh my God, America. Like there was definitely a lot of that where people were like, there was kind of like an, are you okay? And of course the answer is like, none of us are. So,
well, okay. We're still in the honeymoon period though, or as you've described it, the introduction to hell, I guess. And people are finding lots of ways to deal with it. No shortage of news, and things are getting especially interesting in New York, where Trump is from.
Yeah, where it seems like one way to cope with Trump is to try to like be on his team. And a surprising ally for Trump, apparently, New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who has basically attempted to make a deal with Trump's Department of Justice to get a corruption case against him dropped in exchange for cooperating with Trump's immigration priorities, which is like a pretty outrageous quid pro quo.
And last night, it emerged that the interim U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, Danielle Sassoon, has chosen to resign rather than do what Trump wanted. The story is having an update in a minute. This episode that you're listening to will air on February 20th, and reporter Nick Fandos, who's part of the New York Times team covering the story, is here with us today, Friday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody, to talk about covering Trump's attempts to control New York City.
Nick Fandos has been covering politics and policy for the New York Times for almost a decade. As a reporter in Washington, D.C., he chronicled the bruising confirmation fight over Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the first federal criminal justice overhaul in decades, the January 6th attack on the Capitol, 2 impeachments, and who knows how many bills and campaigns in between. He now covers New York politics and government for the Times. Nick, welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. A few days ago, you wrote a story called "An Emboldened Trump Seeks to Bend New York City to His Will." Trump versus the city seems like it could be an epic battle. It's his former hometown anyway. Can you talk a little bit about Trump's interest in the city and why its special needs for funding make it vulnerable to his political pressure right now?
Yeah, well, there's so many ways to answer that question because in many ways Donald Trump is kind of New York City, and modern New York City and the Trump administration are kind of a representation of these fights that he's been playing out on the canvas of Manhattan since the 1970s and 80s. Remember, before he was a politician or even the kind of reality TV star that many Americans met him as, he was a New York City real estate developer in the kind of big bad game of Manhattan in the 70s and 80s. And he cut his teeth fighting with mayors and pulling, the kind of levers of development to get tax breaks and to bully people into selling buildings, making big promises, and then shifting direction, doing something else. It's interesting. I was looking back this week, now that he's back in the White House, at some of the projects that didn't come to fruition, and he also saw himself as a great kind of proposer of big infrastructure projects in the city. And so I say all that because I think he's always been very interested in putting his mark on New York City. And now that he is the president of the United States, once again, he seems determined to try to do so from a policy point of view, and even in something as quotidian as bike lanes in Manhattan.
I was surprised to realize that. I was sort of like, this is about partly congestion pricing. Anyway, we'll get to that. But I want to acknowledge we're recording at like a pretty fraught moment for this particular topic and story. You and I were discussing before we started recording, just sort of like, what were the developments of the last 5 minutes?
So we're going to do Valentine's Day.
And
Friday.
Yeah, it's Friday, February 14th. And the most recent development in kind of this New York City soap opera last night was the resignation of federal prosecutor Danielle Sassoon, along with, when I wrote this question, I think it was 5, and maybe it's now 7 members of the Federal Public Integrity Unit. There's some tweets indicating that maybe Trump's former defense attorney, who is now at Justice, has some of these public integrity lawyers in a room and is threatening to fire them unless one of them agrees to do what Trump wants, which is to drop corruption charges against Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City. And this is ostensibly so Adams can focus on helping Trump with his immigration crackdown. New York has sanctuary laws dating back to 2014, and Trump wants Adams to help him navigate around and through those so that he can take care of he can address the priorities that he's outlined in his kind of mass deportation plans. And so Danielle Sassoon has refused really eloquently. We'll link to her annotated letter in our show notes, kind of to like many people's surprise. It seems like she's conservative. She's like a former clerk for Scalia. She belongs to the Federalist Society, and she is not about to do what she was told to do in this instance. And as the Times pointed out in its coverage of this is some of the most high-profile public opposition we've seen to Trump. Is pretty dramatic. But to understand what she did, you have to understand who Eric Adams is and what he stands for. So for our listeners who aren't New Yorkers, he's like, even for a New York City mayor, pretty distinctive figure. Can you give us a little background? Like, who is Eric Adams?
Yeah, well, let's go back in time a little bit here, because there's so many big narratives that are converging in this story. Like, as a journalist and a storyteller, it's quite challenging even for me to keep all of them straight. But let's start with Eric Adams. He was a former New York City police officer who got into politics. He was once a Republican, but has run as a Democrat. He won office in 2021 in kind of the immediate aftermath of that first wave of COVID. People were getting vaccinated. The city was starting to reopen. There had been quite a lot of economic disruption, and the beginning of concerns that we've seen kind of ebb and flow over the last couple of years about public safety in New York. And Adams really arrived and spoke into that moment, and was elected by a very narrow margin to be the second Black mayor of New York City. At the beginning, he looked like a hugely promising political figure. People calling him the Biden of Brooklyn, suggesting maybe he was going to go big places on the national stage. But he almost immediately became caught up in a series of kind of ethical questions, and then scandals, and then investigations involving a number of the people that he brought into his administration as advisors, and then ultimately his own actions. And that all came to a head last fall in September, when federal prosecutors in Manhattan brought an indictment against him. He's the first sitting mayor to be indicted on federal charges in the history of New York City. This was a big public corruption case. And they came out and said that while he was an elected official in an earlier office and as mayor, he had accepted favors, in this case, a bunch of travel perks, upgraded flights worth tens of thousands of dollars, and free hotel rooms from Turkey in exchange for help financing his campaign with illegal contributions. Foreigners are not supposed to be contributing to New York City elections. They also said that there was a so-called straw donor scheme that was involved in this, helping to finance this campaign. That's where one person is actually putting up the money to support a campaign, but they put somebody else's name on the check to make it look legal. And prosecutors allege that Adams did certain favors in return, most notably leaning on the fire department to speed up the opening of this big Turkish consulate building in Manhattan. It wasn't going to be open in time for President Erdogan of Turkey to kind of christen it in person when he came to New York. The Turks really wanted to do that. So at that point, Adams was the mayor-elect, and prosecutors say he helped speed that up. So they bring this big indictment in the fall. It's a huge deal. A lot of people call on the mayor to resign, but he weathers it. And it's interesting. Two things happen. One, he claims that the indictment was politically motivated. And this is where the kind of second story of this comes into play. New York City has seen a huge influx of migrants over the last 2 years as border crossings increased. Hundreds of thousands of those people ended up in New York City, which has always been a magnet for immigrants in the United States. Many people's families came through New York. But it overwhelmed the city from a financial point of view. And Adams became quite critical of the Biden administration for not doing enough to prop up cities like New York and help them deal with this crisis. So now, under indictment, he says, actually, I did nothing wrong. I'm innocent. They only came after me because I was criticizing them. And this is politicization of the Justice Department. And you can imagine whose ears that echoed in, or whose attention that caught. Donald Trump, who spent the majority of his campaign for election in 2024 saying the exact same thing, that a politicized Justice Department under President Biden had targeted him. There was this kind of dance where Adams begins to make a bet that maybe if Trump's elected, he could help me out. We're in this similar situation, or we both see ourselves in a similar situation. And so he kind of, for a Democrat, he's very gentle with Trump, the candidate. And then after Trump is elected, he undertakes this pretty extraordinary attempt to curry favor with him. Flies down to Mar-a-Lago, rather to I think Trump's golf course nearby, and they have lunch. He goes to Trump's inauguration, something that's quite unusual for a mayor of New York City. For example, his predecessor, Bill de Blasio, protested Trump's last inauguration. He speaks with the president repeatedly. He's got intermediaries working with him, basically trying to make the case, hey, we're like each other. And by the way, I share your goals of once again, immigration. Trump's obviously come into office with immigration being a top priority. Adams says, I can help you accomplish that. And all of these things, this is a long story, but begin to come together in the first weeks of the Trump presidency, where the mayor's legal situation, the corruption charges, which President Trump now has the ability to wipe out, and the immigration agenda of the president all get mixed together.
So I think like you've done a very thorough job of explaining what the corruption charges are. Can you talk a little bit about like why does Trump need Adams to accomplish these immigration goals in New York City? We know that about right, there's the sanctuary laws going back to 2014, and Adams, facing corruption charges, basically tries to get out of it by engaging in, as far as I can tell, more corruption. What was he going to do for Trump in this sort of quid pro quo pattern of his career? And why on earth would he think he would get away with this?
Yeah, so okay, so I brought us up to a few weeks ago. Now I'll kind of bring us up to now. So Trump is trying, as he did in his first term, to take a number of aggressive steps on immigration. So your listeners will be very familiar with a number of these. He's attempted to end birthright citizenship. He's trying to militarize and fortify the border. But one of his top priorities is trying to deport individual migrants that are in the country. And there's been a tension going back to the first administration where, federal authorities have the power to do that, but they often have a hard time finding what is essentially, millions of people who are in many cases kind of deeply woven into American society and American cities.
The reading that I've done shows that he's not really deporting any more people than the Biden administration was. It's not happening.
Right. He has certainly made a much bigger show of it to try and suggest there are more. But I think what you're saying is accurate. But to try and boost those numbers, he wants greater cooperation. He wants to force places like New York, liberal places who have been friendly to immigrants, that have passed sanctuary laws and other policies that basically, say our police or certain institutions can't coordinate with federal immigration authorities. Trump wants to eradicate those laws, but he doesn't control local law. So he's got to use kind of different levers to do it. He's tried threatening federal funding. He's now taking several jurisdictions, Chicago, now New York State, as of this week, to court. And what it appears like, at least at this point, and the details are still unfolding, is that both lawyers for Mayor Adams and for President Trump at the Justice Department seem to have identified the mayor's legal case as one of those levers that he could use. It's a non kind of conventional one, but you have a mayor who was already, Eric Adams has always had a little bit more conservative view than a lot of his party on the immigration question and on law enforcement. But according to the line prosecutors who have, as Suki pointed out, have now quit and written these rather extraordinary letters kind of explaining what happened here. And based on reporting by some of my colleagues at the Times, we know that there were a series of letters and then private meetings between lawyers for the mayor and top officials at the Justice Department, one of whom happens to have been Donald Trump's personal lawyer prior to that. Footnote: the mayor's lawyer is also a lawyer to Elon Musk at the moment. So there's a lot of kind of intertangled webs here, and they start a series of conversations where they say, "Hey, yeah, you've asked for a pardon. It seems the president's not interested in that, but we do think that maybe there's a legal rationale to drop this case if defending yourself against these charges is hindering your ability to kind of assist with or promote the president's immigration priorities." The mayor evidently responds through his lawyers, "Yes, it's absolutely hindering me. It's hindering me in all kinds of things. I wish I could be more helpful, but this legal case is incredibly demanding." And so earlier this week, when the Justice Department moved to drop these cases, they put out moved to drop the charges. They put out a memo that pretty much explicitly said, "We are doing this so that the mayor is free to help us, basically to help ICE and to help the president deport more people from New York." I've been covering these things for a while, not forever, but I can't think of another kind of legal justification that looked like that. We've been calling it in our pages the political justification. It's not even really a legal justification. In fact, the Justice Department said, "We have not at all weighed the merits or the evidence against you. That is not what we're making this decision on." And from there this week, it's the developments have just been drastic. But as all these kind of crisis has now unfolded within the Justice Department over what to do about this, over what the prosecutors who were handling this case are calling a miscarriage of justice. There's been another crisis in New York City because it's made it basically look like, okay, so this mayor is entirely under the thumb of Donald Trump. Prosecutors could bring these charges, are kind of holding these charges over his head unless he cooperates on the immigration front. And so in the middle of all of this, Adams met with Trump's border czar. They've now done a couple of joint TV appearances together. He agreed to some policy changes. They're going to let ICE have an office on Rikers Island, which is New York City's primary jail. They haven't had one there since 2014. Adams seems to be willing to be critical of or try and chip away at sanctuary laws or policies in the city, though those are set legislatively and he can't unilaterally get rid of them. But
But
I
this
don't
is the
exactly
thing.
know where to
No,
center this because there's so many different.
It's
Well,
so
directions to
wild.
go
There's
here.
so much of it.
I think it's important to say like what is the exact thing that is causing people to leave their jobs as United States attorneys is that conflict. And I'm going to read from Hagen Scotten or Scotten's
Scotten, yeah.
Scotten's basically, resignation. Well, it is his resignation letter, and he says that like he's talking about the justifications for dropping the case, Um, he says the first justification, which is like there's something tainted about the indictment, is so weak as to be transparently pretextual. So in other words, they don't have any real actual evidence. But then they say the second justification is worse, which is the one that you're talking about. Like this is getting in the way of him, pursuing Trump's immigration policies. And he writes, no system of ordered liberty can allow the government to use the carrot of dismissing charges or the stick of threatening to bring them again, which is what you're talking about, to induce an elected official to support its policy objectives. I mean, that is the politicization of the Department of Justice. Oddly, something that Trump is constantly accusing the Department of Justice of being, but this is doing that, is it not?
Right. Well, it's led to this kind of remarkable, just from like a linguistic point of view and a terminology point of view. You have on one side the Trump Justice Department in all of these memos justifying its actions by referencing executive orders about ending the politicization of the Justice Department and saying we need to do this because the investigation into Adams was politically motivated.
Okay, I see.
So they say they are fighting
Very
the
tricky.
politicization of justice. And at the same time, these prosecutors who are non-political appointees, they're career prosecutors, although in this case, many of them, Danielle Sassoon being the most notable, are kind of rock-ribbed conservative. I mean, Danielle was a member of the Federalist Society. She clerked for Justice Scalia, a giant of conservative jurisprudence. These are not kind of, squishy liberals. These are not friends of the mayor of New York City. And they're saying, in fact, this is the very politicization you are claimed to trying, that you claim you are trying to root out. And so there's this kind of remarkable talking past each other. But I think from the point of view of Washington and one of the big stories already of this second Trump term, this feels like, obviously the kind of pardoning or commutation of the January 6th rioters was a very big deal on the president's first or second day in office. But this feels like, so far at least, the kind of biggest high watermark or kind of crisis for the Justice Department that has really, is pitting the kind of values of the department and its career workforce against the new sheriffs in town in a huge way. And I think that, I think we may see many more resignations in the coming days. But it's possible a judge could intercede here to kind of slap the Justice Department on the wrist, maybe even appoint a special prosecutor to complete the case. But most likely, they're not going to have much recourse but to sign off on this, and the Justice Department will get what it wants. So that's one thing. And then in New York City, it's set off this whole other crisis, which we can talk more about.
So before we go away from this letter by Hagen Scotten, I just want to read the other line many people are quoting. But any assistant U.S. attorney would know that our laws and traditions do not allow using the prosecutorial power to influence other citizens, much less elected officials, in this way. If no lawyer within earshot of the president is willing to give him that advice, then I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion. But it was never going to be me. I will say that, yeah, that is like I did not expect to see that. Like that is, I mean, Danielle Sassoon's letter is also like very, I don't know, it's very like, there's some weirdly, I like find myself reading these and I'm like like, good writing, guys. Like, if I
Well,
were
no,
going to
it is.
resign in like a way that was like, fuck you, Donald Trump, like, I don't know, like they're like quite eloquent and quite clear and like surprisingly personal in a way that's like, yeah, it's very interesting to see like the version of conservatism that I thought had that I was afraid had vanished. I mean, not that it's like so healthy, but right, that there are still conservatives who are hewing to kind of an older version that is like, I don't know, like adherence and loyalty to the law as they understand it. And um so
It's also notable that the uh, Deputy Attorney General Emile Beauvais, who's the guy who's asking these people to file these charges, does not himself want to want to file the charge, right? He could do it himself and has so far just and the Times has speculated in pieces that I've been reading that, it looks ugly. It would be a problem. He's going to receive criticism and he might not want to go into a courtroom and get yelled at by a judge for doing this.
Right, right. To sign that motion of dismissal.
Yeah.
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is, perhaps Hagen Scotten is a good guest for the show in the future. He may have some time on his hands. I mean, there is something, I write a lot about legal writing. It often comes up, and there is there can be a kind of stiffness or formality sometimes, but I often find there's like a remarkable elegance that comes through from these people who are, trained to kind of isolate arguments and lead with the most powerful arguments and write as succinctly and clearly as possible. Like when applied to a situation like this, I mean, the prose is really quite striking. And all of these letters were written as, just to dwell on this for a moment, were written as internal communications. In other words, Sassoon's letter was written to the Attorney General to inform her of the view of the case and ask for a meeting, though offer her resignation if she wouldn't take that meeting to reconsider the dismissal. But clearly, they're all being written with the eventual public audience in mind, all of us, but then also with the judge in mind. So they're doing an extraordinary amount of work on different levels. They're advancing legal arguments. They're disclosing new information. Sassoon's letter said that, in fact, prosecutors were prepared to bring a superseding indictment with additional charges against Adams, and were not allowed to do so. They were going to charge him with obstruction of justice for trying to delete or destroy evidence, while at the same time trying to speak, more broadly to convey to people why this matters. I just think that's as a textual document, they're quite fascinating.
they're really interesting. And like the carrot and the stick thing also, right? Like if the charges get dismissed, they'll be dismissed, correct me if I'm wrong here, without prejudice, such that they could be resurrected very easily if like Adams doesn't do what Trump wants. So there's the stick.
Right.
And
I just want to editorialize here in a way that is probably, you can't do if you're a reporter, but I'm a novelist. So, I mean, beyond all of the legal talk and all of this stuff, what I saw as soon as like I started Trump starting to speak positively about Adams in the fall, Trump very frequently, when you break the law, you become someone he realizes he can use, right? And particularly now that he has the ability to pardon people, and he knows that Adams needs something. And if you've broken the law and you want it and you're compromised in some way, that makes you a useful person to someone who's running basically an authoritarian government. In my personal opinion, I'm not asking you to ratify that statement. I just think that you'll see Trump use broken people like this, and this guy is gonna, in my view, and for the people who he uses, it doesn't usually go well. Witness Rudy Giuliani. I mean, in my view,
Right.
this is where Eric Adams' story ends. Somewhere he doesn't wear hair dye like Giuliani, but somewhere outside some landscaping service giving a terrible press conference. I just don't think this is going to go well for him.
but
Right.
also,
Well,
oh, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead, Sugi.
Oh, I was just gonna say briefly, also to your point about them being alike, like to the Rikers Island thing, like the loophole that they figured out to get ICE onto Rikers Island has to do with Adams issuing an executive order, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Is this
Right.
like our
Which obviously
new?
Trump is moving by a number of executive orders, is trying to move a lot of his policies that way. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think I actually am less familiar with the history of executive orders in New York City, in full disclosure, than in the presidency, in part because the kind of structure of government in a city like New York is just so different. They usually take on less significance because it's assumed the mayor has greater authority in certain areas, though this isn't one of them. I was just going to say, in response to the earlier point, yes, as a journalist, I'm my job is to report all of these things and not to opine on them. But I do think that it's just objectively true and analytically interesting that the mayor of the nation's largest city seemed to believe that if he could just convince Trump to help give him a legal reprieve, he could kind of regain his footing and control over the city and potentially regain his path to winning a second term, because I haven't mentioned this so far, but he's up for re-election this year, and these charges were obviously going to be a big impediment to doing that. He basically got what he wanted this week, and I think that he totally and potentially fatally miscalculated the effect of that.
Well, okay, so
he now has
we're
potentially foreclosed his path to re-election, and he also is now dangerously close to losing the faith of the city that he leads, that he is acting in their best interest and not Donald Trump's. And
yeah,
that's,
I guess.
that's just a remarkable kind of reversal and misjudgment.
Yeah, so I've said he's going to end up outside Four Seasons Landscaping somewhere, but where do you think he's going to end up? I mean, is it his polling is bad right now? I mean, you also
Right.
wrote a story about him considering running as a Republican, although he's backed away from that or said he won't do that. Um, this is imagining into the future, but what are the options for him going forward?
Yeah, well, this is a question everybody in my world is asking right now because the potential to run as a Republican just seemed like a clear Hail Mary that maybe just underscored how few options he has at the moment. As of right now, he is still actively running for re-election. The Democratic primary is in June. It is very, very, very difficult to see how he could prevail in that primary. Even before his indictment, he had historically low approval numbers for a modern mayor of New York City, based on a whole host of other issues. And basically, if not all, very many of his allies who were willing to defend him even after he was charged with corruption, this week have basically said enough's enough. Like I'm off this particular train. So he is either headed for electoral defeat, or there is the possibility that he could be pressured either to resign more quickly, or in New York, the governor actually has a unique authority which hasn't been used or attempted to be used in 100 years since FDR in the 1930s, to remove the mayor of New York City if he is failing to serve the city's interests. So both those possibilities, I think, hang out there heavily right now. What Adams would do after that, it's hard to
When's
say.
the next election?
When
would he have to run? When is the next New York mayoral election?
It's this year. The primary is in June and the general election's in the fall, but it's hard to see how he would make his way through the primary. So
well, he can join the Trump administration then, right after he
some
loses.
have speculated he could join the Trump administration. Who knows? That's a whole nother story. But I just yeah, I mean, if we go all the way back to where I started, from the like Biden of Brooklyn, calling himself that, to now potentially being the kind of not quite the Trump of New York City in any way, but the Trump associated mayor of New York City. It's quite a journey, and one that doesn't lend itself to political success in a city where I think Democrats still outnumber Republicans something like 7-1.
So the governor had said like that she needed time to think about what she was going to do about Eric Adams. And I don't know how much time she has, but then I also was reading a story that said she'd kind of like put a pause on this, said she wasn't going to do anything about it because she also wants leverage on Trump. And this is where we get to the congestion pricing thing, that Trump cares about congestion pricing in New York City, where there has been like a plan for several years to do this. both to manage traffic and to increase revenue, to upgrade the transit system, which is in like not great shape. And she wants to have the congestion pricing. And so she's trying to get leverage on Trump. So she's using the Adams indictment as well. Like this seems extraordinary because
I
like
think I want to break in and say we also have to explain what congestion pricing is for listeners not in New York City. Here in Kansas City, where we have more highway miles than any city other than LA, we don't have congestion pricing or even know what that might be.
But wait, I think I also actually got this mixed up because the thing that she put a pause on is a bill that would, oh my God, I can't believe how much the story is such a hydra. Like Elise Stefanik, who is a congressional representative from New York, is going to be appointed atrociously to be the ambassador to the UN, which will leave her seat empty. And Hakeem Jeffries, who is the House Minority Leader, was introducing a bill to leave her seat empty for like a while, or that would have that effect. And the governor is now stopping him because his plan would impede the Trump agenda. And so that's actually, the leverage that she's using to try to negotiate with Trump about the congestion pricing. Did I get it right?
I have
I'm failing a test.
Congestion of the mind right now.
Well, you did get it right, but you were actually maybe right in both ways because congestion pricing does intersect with this. The governor, Hochul, is actually scheduled to go down to DC to meet with Donald Trump next week to talk about congestion pricing. And so that is certainly, I mean, she's not explicitly said that, but I understand it to be true that is also on her mind in terms of the timing of how she deals with this situation with the mayor. Now, congestion pricing for the non-New Yorkers, and
it's not when you get a
native
cold
Missourian.
And you have to pay money.
I'm a native Missourian, so coming from a land of cars as well. New York City has put in place a program that was decades in the making. They unveiled it this January that basically adds an additional toll for cars traveling into the heart of Manhattan. And the idea is to try and decrease automobile traffic, make it less congested, and also generate revenue in turn that can be put into the public transit system. This is one of the kind of biggest, most ambitious policy programs that New York has tried to undertake from a public works point of view and a climate point of view in a very long time. London does this, some other cities do it, but New York is the first in the United States. Trump does not like this program. He says that it's crushing New York City. Nobody wants to drive in. It's too expensive. And he's vowing in kind of a populist crusade to try and kill it. Now, the politics of it are quite complicated. There's some Democrats for and against, some Republicans for and against. Anyway, suffice it to say, the governor wants this program to continue. The president does not. And it's another kind of fight they're in, and they're each looking for leverage over the other at the moment. And so she, as Sugi was saying, had the opportunity to kind of put a thumb in his eye by holding Elise Stefanik's House seat open for months and making it harder for him to pass his legislative agenda in the House, which is very narrowly divided. And she's pulled that threat back right now, purportedly to use it as leverage in those congestion pricing negotiations. I don't think it's that hard to think that the situation with the mayor could also become a kind of chit in those back and forth negotiations now.
The idea that someone could impede his entire legislative agenda. I can't tell you how excited I was about this bill. When I was reading about it, I was like, amazing. Like her seat can just sit open. And the fact that she cares so much about the congestion pricing that she's even willing to consider pulling this back and irritating Hakeem Jeffries as well in the process. I don't know. I'm fascinated that it, like the different interests within the party that are at odds, which is maybe not a story that's frequently told. Like we're largely seeing stories of kind of Democrats versus Republicans, and here I feel like we're seeing Republicans versus Republicans and Democrats versus Democrats.
Well, yeah. I mean, if I may, again, as like an observer on the outside of all this stuff, I think that all of these things share something in common, which is emerging kind of early in the second Trump presidency. It was part of the first one, but maybe even more so now. And I do think it's it's something that he kind of learned back in the old days in New York, where things were less ideological and more operational, and you kind of find alliances where you can, and you punch people who were once allies in the face, all to try and get what you want. I think that, like, in ways we haven't seen in a long time, all these things are interconnected, and kind of negotiations and legislating is based on a kind of leverage and power politics, not just ideology. Or that's being inserted into traditionally ideological debates in ways that are creating kind of unpredictable, crazy outcomes. And I think we'll just see more of that, frankly, as time goes on. And maybe we're used to seeing it from Trump, but what all this suggests a little bit to me, with what the mayor has done in one set of circumstances and the governor has done in a very different set of circumstances, suggests that people who are traditionally opposed to Trump are maybe adopting some of those tactics too, which makes sense, I guess, right? People try and figure out what works and what can get them what they want. But I don't know. It's for me as a reporter, it's like a fascinating moment to cover this stuff, because it feels like a lot of rules are kind of shifting and changing, in addition to like basic rules that we've expected, norms at the Justice Department that are being shattered at the same time.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of this expertise, navigating this really complicated story and explaining it to us so clearly. Listeners, you can find Nick Fandos' reporting at the New York Times. Don't miss it. Nick, thank you.
You're welcome. Hopefully I've illuminated and not confused.
Thank you very much.